And this time she gave such a gasping shudder that bango! I heard the stars chiming, and there was my 100 francs gone. And the lights were on again. And with the same alacrity that she had bounced into bed, she was bouncing out again, and grunting and squealing like an old sow.
I'm interested in many other things than sex, naturally. It would be a pity if that was all, you know, yeah.
Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn were banned from the United States and Great Britain for more than 30 years. They offended the censor because they contain several vivid descriptions of a great variety of acts of sexual intercourse. Little is left to the imagination, and the four-letter words that Miller used for the anatomical detail were considered unprintable.
Everyone in the world admits that sex is a very important element in life. We're saying that more and more. Even the people who profess to deny it are admitting it. It's only perhaps that I reinstated it in literature. It had always been there in the past. It's only about 250 years since we have censorship and the castration of literature.
That, though, is absolute nonsense, according to Coral Lansbury, a feminist critic, a novelist, and professor of English at Rutgers University, New Jersey. She's made a detailed study of late Victorian and Edwardian pornography, and by comparison, she says that Miller, writing Tropic of Cancer in the 1930s, was nothing new, and that some of the things that he said about his own writing were just wrong. Statements like this:
Unconsciously, I was reacting unconsciously to the whole puritanical strain in me, in all Americans and English people.
Rubbish. Miller is writing in a long tradition, and he knows it. If you go back to the so-called underground classics from 1860 on, you'll find works being written in exactly the mode and exactly the same form as Henry Miller. People generally were not aware of these works, which were familiar to all upper middle class men in England. Gladstone read pornography. It was widely circulated. But what Miller did was to make this kind of language available to the middle class. I think any clubman in London in 1900 would have picked up Miller and read Miller and said, "Oh yes, not bad, you know. Perhaps not quite as good as The Yellow Room and Parisian Frolics." It would be put in that category. The type of sexual excitation he writes about, men who are in a continual state of sexual arousal, which must be rather burdensome for them and certainly fatiguing for women. This is nothing new. It's something that is peculiar to late Victorian pornography.
Quite apart from not regarding him as in any way original, Coral Lansbury says that Henry Miller writes very badly about sex because his women are unreal.
If there's one thing women don't do, it's screw. What we find in Henry Miller is something that has no relation at all to women's sexual experience or to the way women feel emotionally. The words that Henry Miller uses, the words that men use in sexual intercourse, does not reflect the way women feel. Women are merely the subjects for male sexual authority. So that you have something that is extraordinarily adolescent in Miller, in his treatment of sex.
I don't want to write about Montparnasse. I want to write my life, my thoughts. I want to get the dirt out of my belly. Listen, get that one over there. I had her a long time ago. She used to be down near Les Halles. A funny bitch. She lay on the edge of the bed and pulled her dress up. Ever try it that way? Not bad. She didn't hurry me either. She just lay back and played with a hat while I slugged away at her. And when I come, she says sort of bored like, "Are you through?"
I'm always saddened when I read a man who's so obviously making his own sexual inadequacies the substance of his writing. I find as this continual emphasis, this concentration, this obsession with sexual virility, rather tiresome. It is the little boy flaunting himself, preparing to conquer the whole world of womanhood by one means.
And as well as thinking Miller smutty and adolescent when he's writing about sex, Coral Lansbury finds nothing else to recommend him. A third-rate writer, she says. But others think that there's more to Henry Miller. The list of his admirers includes T.S. Eliot, George Orwell, Ezra Pound, Norman Mailer, Saul Bellow, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Miller's friend and confidant for many years, Anais Nin, a woman writer who's greatly valued by many feminists today. Another admirer and great friend of Miller is the writer Lawrence Durrell. He says that feminists who object to Henry Miller have simply failed to understand him and take him too seriously.
They don't understand that his obscenity is not a brutality. You see, what he's trying to do down is the dreadful sentimentality which disguises brutality. The Diddums, Wasums, animal-loving, American sentimental side. You can only deal with that by writing a dirty word on the wall. So that sometimes his attempts to deal with it were rather infantile. And of course girls take offense with that. They have every right to, I think. But Henry himself would have apologized to them warmly.
Miller often provokes the familiar confusion between the writer and what he writes. Miller the man had a series of chaotic, complex and agonized relationships with women. And Miller the man once said of Miller the writer, "Yes, my writing might be interpreted as erotic, but that isn't enough. I am trying to be a man, to speak as a man speaks, and not to leave out anything because of principles or art or whatever it may be that has constrained men before." And although not leaving anything out was bound to offend the censor, Henry Miller felt that censorship was fundamentally unintelligent. The Tropics of Cancer and Capricorn weren't officially published until the 1960s, but they still got to his readers who were made hungry by censorship.
Despite the censorship, you see, the books got read. And this one thing I feel that censorship always defeats itself. That men have always been able to say what they want despite the conditions. If they can't say it in their own country, it is smuggled out and published in another country. If they can't put it in writing, they put it in words. Their words travel, do you see? You can't suppress free speech or free thought. It's impossible. It's utterly absurd.
Lawrence Durrell first came across Henry Miller's writing thanks to an act of individual censorship. An American on the Isle of Corfu was about to dispose of a copy of Tropic of Cancer down a public lavatory. He relented and gave it to Durrell.
I was absolutely riveted in a couple of pages. It seemed to me this was remarkably revolutionary, and it was psychologically more mature than Lady Chatterley, which was the only other sort of rebel book that I knew. And for a young man who needed guidance and needed energizing, it was absolutely riveting in its poetry and its obscenity. But obscenity is a positive thing, not as just simply a shock-making thing, but an energizing and revealing thing. It was somebody who discovered himself and kicking over all the Aunt Sallies of American life, as Lawrence had tried to kick over the Aunt Sallies of British life.
And Durrell was sufficiently energized to get in touch with Miller, and they became close friends.
He was a great man. Great, warm, burring, very American rebel. I mean, he might have been invented by Hemingway. I mean, he was a natural. And yet he could behave like a stevedore if he wanted. You felt instantly about the sort of enormous vibration of his personality. It was like a sort of gong. And, of course, marvelous sense of humor and no stuck-upness at all. A natural great.
And Durrell also well remembers how women would fall for Henry Miller.
He was rather a terror. The trouble was he was so congenial and so companionable they couldn't leave him alone because he was thoroughly sweet. At the same time, he had a sort of Strindbergian tempo to his life, which led him to all kinds of rash statements. And he wanted to marry everyone he set eyes on, which led to complications, because you can't. But I think none of the girls, even those who felt hardly done by Henry, really regretted the meeting, because he gave so much that he kind of irradiated a part of their own natures. He was an experience such as you couldn't get elsewhere, even if it was rather a bitter one.
Miller did marry 5 times, and there were many affairs. He had 3 children. His own childhood was spent in Brooklyn, He was born in 1891. His parents were German immigrants, and Henry only began to learn English at school when he was 5. His memories of childhood were memories of a rough and very real city.
You know, I always considered myself a fortunate man in this sense that I had the freedom to roam the streets when I was very young. And this I considered a real gift given to me.
To be born in the street means to wander all your life, to be free. It means accident and incident, drama, movement. It means, above all, dream. In your street, you learn what human beings really are. Nothing of what is called adventure ever approaches the flavor of the street. The boys you worshiped when you first came down into the street remain with you all your life. They are the only real heroes. Napoleon, Lenin, Capone, all fiction. Napoleon is nothing to me in comparison with Eddie Carney, who gave me my first black eye.
Henry Miller's father was a tailor. Miller worked in his shop every now and then, and later on as a messenger and then employment manager for the Western Union Telegraph Company. As employment manager, he gave jobs to a number of oddball people, many of whom turn up in his books. In Tropic of Capricorn, the Western Union has become the Cosmo-Demonic Telegraph Company. He lived and worked in New York through his 20s and most of his 30s. There were wild and complicated relationships and marriages, and he had one affair with his mother-in-law. When he met his second wife, June Mansfield, he left Western Union and worked as a bartender and short-order cook in the speakeasy that she'd opened. But they had to keep their marriage a secret, because many of the men who drank in the speakeasy were June's current lovers, and a lot of them gave her money, which she and Henry badly needed. At the same time, married to June, Henry had some time to write.
June was an extraordinary woman, one out of 10,000. I had character, intelligence, vivacity, everything, and also kept me while I became a writer, supported me. When I began to write in New York, I was 33. And you know why I began at 33? I would have been lingering still, probably. My wife told me one day, she said, you know, they say that if you have not begun your life's work by the time Jesus died, you will never do it. Do you know that? And that lodged in my head. And then one day she said to me, why do you continue doing this work on the Western Union? Give it all up. And I said, what would we live on, don't you know? She says, I'll take care of you, don't worry. I'll devote myself to taking care of you. And she did, you know. And that's another reason I revere her name. Not only started me on the writing, but supported me. And always found everything I wrote wonderful, don't you know?
But by Henry Miller's own admission, what he wrote when they were in New York was never much good. But everything changed when he and June Mansfield went to Paris. Miller was nearly 40, and he was seduced by what he called the eloquent surprises at every turn of the street. He wrote that to get lost in Paris is an adventure extraordinary. The streets sing, the stones talk, the houses drip, history, glory, romance.
It's true that at 40, when most people are getting worried about old age, I was just beginning to live. That happened because I met with Paris, because of the atmosphere around me and the particular friends that I met. But mostly the atmosphere, the general atmosphere. I don't mean just one thing, bars or dining rooms and meals and so on, but everything about Paris. The circulation in the streets, the language itself, the slang, every aspect of the city was something of great vital importance to me, and like a lesson to learn, you know.
His relationship with June Mansfield soon deteriorated. He was very jealous, in fact, of all her affairs. She returned to New York, and they were eventually divorced. In Paris, Henry Miller had hardly any money. He gradually sold most of his clothes to buy bread, and for a little while slept in a friend's office. But then he got a job as proofreader at the Paris bureau of the Chicago Tribune. But the $12 a week that they paid him was barely enough, so he made a careful arrangement with his friends that each one would feed him once a week. He had many friends and spent much of his time with artists and other writers. And it was with one of those writers, Anais Nin, that Miller had a deep and lasting friendship. She gave him emotional support and she encouraged his writing. Lawrence Durrell says it's quite remarkable how suddenly, in Paris, the writing began to pour from Henry Miller.
On the Paris scene, the amazing thing was that the transformation happened almost overnight, because he'd written quite a number of books, and they are of a banality and a stupidity and an absurdity that you can hardly credit it to this great man. And then suddenly, bang, like an axe falling, he found his tone, and out came Cancer and Capricorn.
Wandering along the Seine at night, wandering and wandering, and going mad with the beauty of it. The trees leaning to, the broken images in the water, the rush of the current under the bloody lights of the bridges, the women sleeping in doorways, sleeping on newspapers, sleeping in the rain. Everywhere the musty porches of the cathedrals, and beggars and lice and old hags full of St. Vitus dance. Pushcarts stacked up like wine barrels in the side streets. The smell of berries in the marketplace, and the old church surrounded with vegetables and blue arc lights. The gutters slippery with garbage, and women in satin pumps staggering through the filth and vermin at the end of an all-night souse. The Place Saint-Sulpice, so quiet and deserted, but towards midnight there came every night the woman with the busted umbrella, the ribs hanging down, her dress turning green, her bony fingers and the odor of decay oozing from her body. And in the morning I'd be sitting there myself, taking a quiet snooze in the sunshine, cursing the goddamn pigeons gathering up the crumbs everywhere.
He didn't sit down and construct from notebooks. He kind of got into a key, like, I've seen the same look on the face of Yehudi Menuhin when he picks up his fiddle, for example. He sort of feels, because fiddle has no frets, as he once gravely explained to me. It's like an extension of your arm, and you feel your way into it. Well, Miller behaved like that with a typewriter, which nobody else I know does, like a musical instrument. And then he'd get up and sort of reel away from it and say, let's see what we got.
Henry Miller wanted to innovate and strike away from the restrictions of convention, and the opening lines of Tropic of Cancer make it very clear that he did not intend to write a novel with shape or form.
I have no money, no resources, no hopes. I'm the happiest man alive. A year ago, 6 months ago, I thought I was an artist. I no longer think about it. I am. Everything that was literature has fallen from me. There are no more books to be written, thank God. This, then? This is not a book. This is libel, slander, defamation of character. This is not a book in the ordinary sense of the word. No, this is a prolonged insult, a gob of spit in the face of art, a kick in the pants to God, man, destiny, time, love, beauty, what you will.
You see, at the very beginning of my writing career, this business of trying to write in a form, such as the novel, for example, was something I couldn't cope with. I wrote 2 books which I suppose would be called novels. They've never been published, thank God, and I never will see them published. But I discovered I couldn't do that. Primarily, I think, for the reason that I feel, first, we cannot give the whole man in a novel. I don't know, maybe people would say Dostoevsky has done that. Perhaps he has. But if so, he's almost unique, in my opinion. But more than that is that I feel that it's an artifice, you see. When you invent characters and dialogue, I cannot swallow fictive characters. I see no reason why we shouldn't have real characters and reality. By temperament, that's how I'm constituted. And all I wanted to do was to paint a picture of someone whom I know well. And that was primarily myself, and then naturally my friends, all those with whom I had experience.
I have a bottle between my legs and I'm shoving the corkscrew in. Mrs. Wren has her mouth parted expectantly. The wine is splashing between my legs. The sun is splashing through the bay window. And inside my veins there's a bubble and splash of 1,000 crazy things that commence to gush out of me now, pell-mell. I'm telling him everything that comes to mind, everything that was bottled up inside me, and which Mrs. Wren's loose laugh has somehow released. With that bottle between my legs and the sun splashing through the window, I experienced once again the splendor of those miserable days when I first arrived in Paris, a bewildered, poverty-stricken individual who haunted the streets like a ghost at a banquet.
Henry Miller himself described Tropic of Cancer as an autobiographical document. But he was once asked if he'd ever deliberately become down and out and poverty-stricken in Paris in order to get experience for writing.
Oh no, never did that thought occur to me. It seems to me, you see, that I'm one of those people to whom things happen. I don't think I have much control over my doings and goings. I'm a man who's carried this way and that by forces that he doesn't understand himself, I think. No, this is the last thing in the world would occur to me, to set out to live a life in order to write it. I had already lived a good, rich life by the time I got to writing Tropic of Cancer. And it was an act of desperation, because I considered myself a complete failure, even in writing, which was my last resort, you know.
Miller once wrote, "As one who has lived a complicated life, I should certainly never want my motives examined with a cold, worldly eye." He did not like biographers.
There's a case in point where a man at a university here in California came to me one day through a friend of mine. I was with some friends in this room playing ping pong, and he came and he was very arrogant, and he said, "I have to talk to you. I want to do a biography of you." I said, "But I don't want any. I've done my own biography." "Oh, no," he says, "you've left out many, many things. I've been on your trail. I've been tracking things down." I said, "I hate you." I said, "Get out of this house." And that guy, I chased him out, and would you believe it? In the last 3 years, he's gone all around the world gathering evidence, and he has written a book. I made him say, on the cover, he has to say, "an unauthorized biography." I refused to read it.
Miller thought that one of his own best books was The Colossus of Marousi, a work that the censor never suppressed. It's about a journey in Greece with Lawrence Durrell. Miller's description of arriving in a large ship at the small port on Poros is as vivid as film.
Suddenly I realized that we were sailing through the streets. If there's one dream which I like above all others, it is that of sailing on land. Coming into Poros gives the illusion of the deep dream. Suddenly the land converges on all sides and the boat is squeezed into a narrow strait from which there seems to be no egress. The men and women of Poros are hanging out of the windows, just above your head. You pull in right under their friendly nostrils, as though for a shave and haircut en route. The loungers on the quay are walking with the same speed as the boat. They can walk faster than the boat if they choose to quicken their pace. To sail slowly through the streets of Poros is to recapture the joy of passing through the neck of the womb. It is a joy too deep almost to be remembered.
Henry Miller is often described as a mystic. He didn't like that word, but he did admit to having the gift of being able to sense and convey dimensions beyond the obviously physical world. On a Greek mountain, he saw a shepherd and his sheep, and he saw beyond into a peaceful eternity.
We come out on the far hillside into a panorama of blinding clarity. A shepherd with his flock moves about on a distant mountainside. He's larger than life. His sheep are covered with golden locks. He moves leisurely in the amplitude of forgotten time. The shepherd is eternal, an earthbound spirit, a renunciator. On these hillsides forever and ever there will be the shepherd with his flock. He will survive everything, including the tradition of all that ever was.
It's the sense of whether life is a thing of spirit. Everyone knows what it is. This is the essential thing, I think. The knowledge or the awareness of spirit and its domination of all life, do you see? This is one of the reasons, let's say, we are here on Earth, is, don't you know, is to find out such things.
And he believed that America had lost its spirit, that America had become evil. The American way of life, he said, is an illusory kind of existence. The price demanded for the security and the abundance that it pretends to offer is too great. One of the illusions was the notion that new was good.
In America, the destruction is completely annihilating. There is no rebirth, only a cancerous growth, layer upon layer of new poisonous tissue, each one uglier than the previous one.
When Miller went back to live in America, he got as far away as he could from the new, and he was blissfully cut off from what he called the air-conditioned nightmare. He died at Big Sur in 1980, aged 88. His own motto was always merry and bright. Interviewed when he was 86, he seemed pretty merry and bright about the prospect of death.
I expect to die, look, like this in bed, my arms folded, and a smile, a seraphic smile on my face. In my sleep, that's how I expect to die. After I'm dead, I have always said, you can do anything you like. Burn the house down, destroy my books, anything. And when I'm dead, I'm out of it, thank God. Because I expect to enter another world. Though I am not a believer, I can't say it in that tone, but I do think that there is more to life than this earthly life. And that if this one was as good as it was for me, the other one will be even better. Do you see? I think I'd have a good time in hell even, you know. Probably would. There's where I'd meet my cronies, the men I love. Never in heaven, naturally, if there were a heaven.
Rebels was written and presented by Hugh Sykes. The readings were by Lou Hirsch. Research